Do you remember your first experience with a computer? I don't mean actually having to work on. I mean actually having to work on it, not just having someone else, go someplace and they were using one, but the first time that you actually encountered a computer. Do you remember that? I do. It was back in my freshman year of college at Bradley University, and I had to take a computer programming class. And back then, that was in the days of punch cards and mainframes. Anybody know what those are? Okay. I don't even know what language, we were working in at the time, but all I know is that if you used a semicolon instead of a colon, what happened? Nothing. Meaning that nothing happened. I mean, it would not work unless everything was just absolutely perfect. I can't tell you how many late nights I spent in the computer lab at Bradley University trying to change colons to semicolons or vice versa in order to get a simple program to run, probably something today that would be comparable of adding a list of numbers in Excel, That would be probably, I worked weeks on a program that actually did that. I also remember the first home computer that Sharon and I got. It was an Apple Macintosh with an external floppy disk drive, And we thought it was amazing because, you could actually put a program in the disk. It would load into the computer because it had a whole 514K of memory. And then it would load up, and then if you wanted to do anything, you had to switch disks. And so you were swapping back and forth all the time. But it was amazing because you could actually word process. You could play games. I think Pong was like one of the best ones. And then you could even do a report that you didn't have to type, and you could correct mistakes, all that kind of stuff. I think it's amazing as I look at, today's computers are just a billion times faster to do things that we used to do back then. And if you think about the fact that our cell phones today do as much computing as the computers that were used to send men to the moon, I find that absolutely fascinating. The ability to use apps and other programs on our phones whereby pretty much if you've got a smartphone, you can do anything that people can do on a computer. I find the whole idea of AI, artificial intelligence, I find that fascinating. I'm just not intelligent enough to know anything about it, so I'm just going to have to ask Siri to tell me about that. Technology can be both a blessing and a curse. One thing for sure is that in March of this year, I was very thankful for the technology that was at our disposal. Because on March 21st, when everything was shut down and we couldn't have our weekly worship gatherings here at the church, we had to scramble. And it was a laptop, that we went to help record messages, and a laptop or another desktop computer that we used to put together worship services that we could put together and then put online for people to be able to watch at home. We still struggle with our limited internet capabilities here at the church, and you know what? We've come a long ways, though, from just being able to do what we're doing today from what we were doing back then, because one of the things we first tried to do was Facebook Live. Some of you were watching this morning on Facebook Live. I think this is just an incredible opportunity for you to stay at home, be in your pajamas, and watch the service, You can be a part of this, and I think that's just absolutely amazing. Before March, I knew of a few churches who were doing live streaming. Nowadays, I know of almost all churches who have had to adapt to this new reality that we're living in. For those of you who are watching at home, let me assure you, we're continuing to try to improve this experience, for you. And so I just thank you for all of your patience and your faithfulness in watching week after week. As a result of this wonderful world of technology that we're living in, I think it's made many of us rethink church. And I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to ask some important questions. And so we're doing a series of messages now entitled Rethinking Church, Considering the Important Questions. Last week we kicked it off with a question that I think it's still something that we have to wrestle with, and that is the church even still relevant in the age that we live in? Today I want to dive into another question that I have heard people ask. And I know it's one that some of you have been asking as well, and that is, why go to church when I can stay home and watch it in my pajamas? Out of all the questions that we're going to look at in this series, I think this one is probably going to be one of the hardest ones for me to share on, because I can honestly say my heart's torn in two. Because I know that if I weren't in the position that I'm in now, and that if we had young children, I don't know that I would want to get up each week and come to a building and have to fight the kids and have to go through all of the effort to be in a church building, maybe coming into contact with somebody who has had contact with somebody who might have had the COVID symptoms. I don't know. I probably would be one of those people who would be sitting at home right now watching the service on TV instead of at church. But there's another part of me that receives so much encouragement from seeing your smiling eyes. I used to say faces, but when you come in with all your masks on, I can't see your face. I can just see your smiling eyes. And I got to tell you, feelings of isolation can dissipate pretty quickly when I'm sitting in a service and I hear you singing and we're taking the Lord's Supper together. I think there's something different about experiencing a live service and experiencing a live streaming service, and I've tried to figure out what that is, and I've done a little bit of study, and I've tried to figure out, is there some biblical basis for why we meet together? And I think I may have found an answer in one of the most theologically rich books in all of the Bible. When you think and read the book of Hebrews, when you think about it in the New Testament, what do you think? For me, when I think of Hebrews, I think about a deep dive into theology. I personally love how the Hebrew writer takes so much Old Testament foundation and applies it to Jesus Christ. And he does so in such an eloquent way that he elevates him to a level of deity that I don't see in many other books in the New Testament. And for me to preach a sermon out of the book of Hebrews often means that you're going to get a really meaty message that you're going to have to take home and chew on for a few days. But you know what? The writer gives us more than just stuff for brainiacs. He gives us some real-life application, some very practical advice that we can apply to our lives. And so today what I want to do is I want to consider one of those applications that he gives to us, and see if maybe it helps us answer the question of why go to church when I can stay home and watch it. Let me say up front, the answer isn't going to be the same for everybody. Because there's going to be some people who the answer are going to be that they probably need to stay home because that's where these things can take place. But for others, perhaps we need to consider that we come back and be a part of a gathering of believers as well. The application, if you want to turn in your Bibles, I think comes after a very eloquent presentation that talks about the atonement that Jesus Christ provided for us on the death on the cross. Turn to Hebrews chapter 10. And I think Hebrews chapter 10 is perhaps one of the most amazing chapters in all of the Bible when it comes to theology. And what we do is we see the writer then asking us to apply what is our reaction, or what is our response going to be to what Jesus has done for us. And we can tell that he's making this shift from this huge teaching moment in the first 18 verses. In verse 19, he leads with the word therefore. That lets us know there's a change taking place. Read with me from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 and 20. The writer says, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God. Let me stop there for a second and say this. I've been known, from time to time to come up with some pretty long run-on sentences, but this, I think, tops all of mine, because it just keeps going. Okay, so let me kind of summarize what the writer is trying to say here in verses 19 and 20. What he's saying is Jesus gave us direct access to God. I think you can summarize everything he says in that statement. Jesus gave us direct access to God. You see, before Jesus died on the cross, pretty much if people wanted to communicate with God or hear something from God, they had to go through a priest or a prophet. So you might say that they were separated from God. In fact, ever since Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, there was separation and communication difficulty between God and people. But when Jesus died on the cross, what he did is he removed the barriers, he opened the door, he paved the way, he became our tour guide right into the very throne room of God. And that's what the writer's talking about here. And if we think about it, that is huge. We have access to Almighty God because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. So what's our reaction going to be? What's our response to that supposed to be? You know what? I think if we read on, there are three reactions that the writer gives us. And what I want to do is I want to look at each of those reactions. And after looking at them, I want to ask a question of application that I think might help answer this question of where is it best for us to experience worship? I think we need to think about these, and I think we need to understand that the answers may be different for different people. But let's consider this first reaction that he gives to us, and that is this. We are to draw near to God. Say those first two words with me. Draw near. We are to draw near. You know, whether or not we draw near to God, I think will determine whether or not we're going to be religious from afar or we're going to have a personal relationship with God through Jesus. We all know people who say that they're very spiritual and religious, don't we? But you can tell by the tone of their voice and what they're saying is they really don't have a relationship with God. I think the reason is because they've never drawn near to God. Listen to how the Hebrew writer says it in verse 22. He says, "Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water." Again, another pretty good run-on sentence if you ask me. I think drawing near is a reflection of our faith and how we are going to respond to what Jesus has done for us. If you look at some of the words, he talks about being a sincere heart. That's one that's not divided. That's one that's full of truth. And you know what? If there's any doubt, there is no doubt in a sincere heart and who Jesus is and what he did. And you know the truth, and the truth has set you free. And one of the things that the truth has set us free from is guilt. I talk to a lot of people who feel like they're separated from God, and usually it comes down to this issue of guilt about something that they've either done in their long past, their distant past, or maybe just in the last few times, but they're feeling this separation from God. The Hebrew writer then goes on to talk about the role that baptism plays in this cleansing process. If you look at those phrases, having our hearts sprinkled, that's imagery from the Old Testament, okay? That comes from the times when priests and people were sprinkled in order that they would be able to serve in a particular capacity. But when it talks about the washing with pure water, I think most people would agree that that's a direct reference to Christian baptism. And what happens at Christian baptism is that we've confessed our sin, we've sought Christ's forgiveness, we've experienced the power of being immersed in the water, coming up out of it like Jesus did, and we feel clean. And we're as close to God at that moment as we ever were. I think in 30 years of ministry, one of my favorite things to do is to look at people's face as I bring them up out of the water of baptism. Because you know what? I've never had somebody frown or look mad when they come out of the water. What you see is just pure joy. And I think the reason for that is because they know at that moment they are spotless and they are clean and they are as close to God as they will ever be. I can't help but think that's why the Hebrew author here talks about baptism when he's talking about how we draw near to God. And for those of us who have experienced Christian baptism, yet we know that there are times when this guilt and this shame can come back into our lives and it will separate us from God. But you know what? We have to remember this. We don't have to be rebaptized every time we feel that way because we have the ability, because of what Jesus did for us, to confess that sin and accept that forgiveness and be cleansed without even having to get back into the water. And what it does, I think, is it makes it where when we walk into the throne room of God, we don't stand in the back and look from afar, but we run to the throne of our Father and we say, Daddy, can I sit on your lap? You see, that's the difference of drawing near and staying far. And what's our reaction? What does God want us to do when we think about what Jesus has done for us? What he wants is for us to climb up on his lap and love him like our dad. So here's a question I think for us to consider about where's the best place for us to experience this particular thing. So the question would be, where's the best place for me to draw near to God? Think about that question in your life. Where is the best place for you to draw near to God? You know what? For some people, they will say, well, you know what? That's in my backyard, in my sweats, watching TV on a computer. I've talked to a lot of people who think that they can draw closer to God in nature than they can in any building. And you know what? I have to confess, I'm probably one of them. I feel a connection with God when I'm outside and doing things and seeing all of the greatness of what he's done. But when we do that, we have to ask ourselves this question. Are we able to then confess and draw near to God and eliminate the guilt and feel that same way that we did the moment that we came out of those baptismal waters, knowing that we were as close to God as we'll ever be? God doesn't want us to be religious. What he wants is a relationship. You've heard that before, but sometimes we just need to be reminded that it's all about our relationship with God, made possible by Jesus Christ. That's the first reaction. I think there's a second one that simply says this. We are to hold tightly to hope. Say that with me. Hold tightly. Hold tightly. Draw near, hold tightly to the hope. You know, Donald Guthrie is one of my favorite New Testament scholars, and he says this: if the first reaction talks about our personal devotion or faith, the second one is talking about our consistency of that faith. The Hebrew writer says it this way in verse 23. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. I love that word, unswervingly. When was the last time you used that in a sentence? I don't know that I've ever used the word unswervingly in a sentence, except when I've read this verse of Scripture. Other translations use the word not wavering. The idea is to be steady and unmoved in our hope, whether it's the current hope or hope for the future. And we are that way because we know that God is always faithful, the author tells us, and that he's always in control. I also like the words that he uses there when he says we profess. The hope we profess. You know what? We know people who profess to be followers of Jesus, but when things start to get a little rough in their life, what do you hear? You hear a lot of doubts. You hear a lot of questions. Now, let me be the first to say, I'm all for doubts and questions, especially when you're first coming into that relationship with Jesus and you're trying to figure out who he is and put all the pieces together. There's room for all kinds of doubts and questions there. But you know what? Once we make that decision and once we give our lives to Jesus Christ, I think there comes a time when we have to decide, do we believe it or not? And if every time we hit a bump on the road, it throws us off course, then maybe we need to ask ourselves, which path are we following? When things start to get a little rough and all we do is have doubts and questions about God, what does that say about the depth of our hope that we have? Let's apply this reaction to Jesus' atonement with this question then. Where is my hope strengthened the most? Where is the place that you can find where you can be more consistent in your faith? I know for some people that's listening to maybe 3-4 sermons a week online of different preachers. And you know what? That's awesome if that makes your faith more unswerving, whatever that means. But for others, I know that if you're alone too long, what happens is that Satan starts to play mind games. And the mind games are what leads to the doubts and the questions. So let me encourage you to find that happy place, wherever it is, that helps you hold on to that hope that you know and that you've enjoyed throughout your life. There's one final reaction that I think the writer gives to us that I want to end with today, and that is that we should consider how to make one another better through love. Draw near, hold tightly, and consider how to make one another better through love. If drawing near deals with our personal faith and holding tightly deals with our consistency, then this is the social element of our faith. And as much as we want to make our faith a personal thing just between us and God, you know what? The Bible teaches pretty clearly that there is a social element when it comes to other followers of Christ. The expectation is this, that we are interacting with them and helping them grow in their faith. Look at verses 24 and 25 with me out of Hebrews chapter 10. The writer says, "Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." Some may look at those two verses and say, well, Dave, there's really two things there. You're saying just consider how, but there's two things. It says consider how and then not meeting together. But you know what? I see them together. I see them going together because when you read the phrase, let us encourage one another, I think it ties them together. I think to encourage one another is the best way to spur one another towards greater love and good deeds. One of the things we have to keep in mind is back when this was written, there was probably two ways that people could communicate with one another. One was face-to-face. The other was through written correspondence, but like might happen this year at the election, the mail was kind of delayed. And so, you know what? What he's stressing here is the importance of meeting with someone because we're still living in the last days. And we need to encourage one another to be ready for that time when Jesus returns. Here's the biggest challenge I see with being in the habit of not meeting with other Christians, and that is that we begin to feel isolated. And once we feel that way, we become like that deer or that antelope that kind of just moves away from the rest of the herd, from the rest of the group, and right into the path of a hungry lion who's ready to pounce. You know as well as I do that that's how Peter describes Satan in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. But in addition to feeling isolated, there's something else that's just so encouraging about being in the same room with other people and who are worshiping and expressing their love to God. I was in a group last week where a couple was sharing the difference that they've experienced between worshiping at home and then worshiping with another group of people. And they said, well, the biggest things for them is that when they're at home, there are so many distractions. And yet when they're together with other believers, it's so much easier to focus on God. You know, granted, with today's technology, it is possible to love and to encourage one another with FaceTime and Instagram and video chats and texts. And if you really want to go old school, you can still call people on the phone, I think, and hear a live voice. For there was a point in time when, as a church, we couldn't do anything in person. We could only do it with technology. Let me just say how thankful I am that I'm able to look out and see faces instead of just look at a camera and try to share a message. I think I appreciate so much what those of you are doing who are coming and worshiping here at the church, because you're being very safety-minded. You're being very cautious. You're taking into consideration other people. I appreciate that so much. If you saw in the newsletter a few weeks ago, we bought this disinfecting fogger, okay, that's supposed to be able to disinfect rooms like this. And so we're spraying this room and the hallways and every room that people come into contact each and every week. And you know what? In my mind, we do that for one reason. And that is to give you a safe place to be able to come and encourage one another to grow in each other's faith. Some of you I know are still at home and you're concerned about coming to the building, and I understand that. I really do. Please stay safe. That's all I ask. Please stay safe. But also please make sure that you're growing in your faith. And just know this, okay, if you're at home watching this, we all look forward to the day when you can come back and be a part of this gathering and feel comfortable in doing so. So the last question that I would apply this teaching from this great writer is this: where can I best help someone else? Where can I help make someone else better? Wherever that is, whether that's in this room or it's at home using technology, my prayer is that we are helping one another become better, especially when it comes to love. Now, I know all of you well enough to know that you've picked up on something during this sermon, and that is that the Hebrew writer uses the same three things in reaction that the Apostle Paul used in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 of what our response should be to Jesus Christ. Look with me at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13. He says, "And these three remain: faith, hope, and love. We can draw near to God, that increases our faith. We can hold tightly to our hope, that gives us the ability to not be wavering. And we can consider how to keep one another growing in love." So South Fork and anybody who listens to this message, the best answer that I can give to you about why should I go to church instead of staying home and watching a service is at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13, where the Apostle Paul says this: "The greatest of these is love." Can we make sure that we're finding a way, whether we're sitting at home or whether we're sitting in this room at the intersection of Johnson and Breckenridge Roads, can we find a way to encourage one another so that we can become more loving and more faithful to the one who gave his life and gave us access to God?